Hey everyone, welcome to Hand Lettering with Sharpie and Michaels. My name is Flux, aka John Malloy. I am an illustrator and fine artist, and I've done everything from children's books to apparel to advertising to packaging design, lots more, as well as actual real life paintings for galleries. You can check out more of my work at fluxartist.com. You can also follow me on Twitter or Instagram via fluxartist. And today I'm going to share with you just an intro to hand lettering with a design in honor of Mental Health Awareness Month. We tried to pick some colors that were bright and cheerful and something that is just light and airy as a concept. And it's a fairly simple design, so hopefully you'll have a lot of fun with it. So I'm going to get into the materials. We suggest using markers from Sharpie's Mystic Gems pack, which is what I'll be using today, and they're available at michaels.com, as well as a 9x12 or roughly around that size pad of smooth Bristol paper. And Bristol paper is nice because it's like a thick paper, almost like a cardstock, especially for markers, so they don't bleed through. And then you'll need some kind of pencil that's light. So an H pencil, a hard pencil. Prismacolor makes awesome turquoise pencils that work really well for that. And then also just an eraser. Prismacolor makes a magic rub. All of these things are available at michaels.com. And then some kind of sharpener. You can use one of these. I'm actually going to use an electric sharpener just for ease, but we won't need it that much just because it's just for the first pencil. So feel free to share your work on social media, either while you're working or when you're finished. And you can tag Sharpie or make it with Michaels. You can even use an @Sharpie just to share your work with Sharpie in general and the followers there. So with that, I think we're ready to begin. All right, so I'm going to literally open this up right now. One thing about when you use any kind of artist tools like this that come in a pack, the packaging is kind of difficult to work with as far as like, oh, can I work with this and actually take these out of here and how is it going to work out? I'm just going to dump these all into a canister. Many of you probably already do this, but if you have a jar or something like that, it makes it way easier to work with them and, pick out your favorite color. So that's that. I'm just going to get started with that. Put this on the side, and then using my pencil, this is let's see here, an HB. So it's light, but it's a little bit darker for the camera. I think, sometimes it's hard to see if you're using something super light. So at least on screen, you'll be able to see this. So lettering is kind of interesting. There's so many different kinds of lettering you can do. And this one is, like I said, it's fun, simple, curvy, kind of, whimsical. And the way that I usually start is by starting small. So I'll do like a thumbnail. So if you were going to write something out, what I would suggest is start small. Make a little version of it first. So I'm going to make a little square on my page here and start to draw what I want to draw. So I'm going to write the words, "You are not alone," right? So that's a nice message for Mental Health Awareness Month, especially after the past few years, the pandemic. I think it's really important for us to realize that. And in the most odd way, it's brought people together. So I'm going to do something a little curvy. And like I said, just almost like a cursive Y. And then get my O there and my U. And I want to leave space for "are not" in here. The great thing about working small is that you can erase and redraw as you need to. So for instance, I want to have "alone" down the bottom. So I'm going to go ahead and draw that in. And this is just a style that I developed on my own. Like, it's not really anything in particular, but I'm going to use two different font styles just to mix it up a little bit. So at this point, I might want to make the bottom part a little bit more rigid, and I can use my eraser to just redo that. So this is sort of like working out your design before you actually do it. All
Yeah,
right.
Just because it is, I know your person probably even darker than you would for the camera, but every once in a while, just maybe hold it up to the camera to
Oh, sure. I can even press a little harder. Let
get
me
a
know.
good glimpse of it.
Is that better? Can you guys see
Yeah,
better?
that's perfect.
Okay. So, and the thing is with this, you don't have to use a light pencil. This is just your tester, so to speak. All right, and then I'm going to go ahead and put R and knot in this area and kind of have them going up on a slant. And if it's helpful, if you want to do slanted text, you can go ahead and put a line in there, especially when you're doing your thumbnail, because you don't have to worry about it being there. And then I'm going to go ahead and put the rest of the text underneath on the same kind of angle. So the other thing that I want to do is I want to add some sort of foliage around it. And my box might be a little constrictive, so I'm going to go ahead and get rid of it. It was a good idea to start with. Kind of gave me a place to start, but you don't have to stay within that, especially because this is the experimental part. So I'm going to go ahead and put like a little vine going like this. And you notice I'm just using like overlapping strokes. I'm not trying to be perfect here. And then just give it some leaves. So this kind of helps me figure out where everything is going to go, how it's going to look before I even do the final work. So I'm just repeating this pattern around like that. I'm going to do another one on this side. So it's nice. A lot of times with lettering, it's really cool to have designs that wrap around and repeat themselves. So in this case, I'm going to do that with another vine, almost as if it's hugging the letters. And then just do the same thing with my leaves around the side. All right, and I'll pull this up closer in a second so you guys can see. All right, so that's kind of where I'm at right now. And then the last things I'm going to add is just for mental health awareness. I'm going to throw in a few little hearts. And I'm just going to fill those in because it doesn't really matter. I don't have to have an outline necessarily. So, and maybe one just right up here on the top left corner. So something like that. All right, so that's kind of my guide. I'm going to put this over to the side and actually start doing this as a whole piece. So I know like sometimes big pages can be intimidating. Just get in there, go for it. If you're using a light pencil, it's not that big of a deal. But what I would say is, we're going to do block lettering in a way. These are going to be almost three-dimensional. They have a fill. But to start, just use line work, and that'll make sense in just a second. So what I'm doing is I'm making my Y, basically just like my small sketch. And I'm going a little darker here so you guys can see. And then I'm going to go ahead and put in my O. Same way, right? And then my U. Now from here on out, we're going to expand this. So before I even go further, I just want to show you what I mean by that. So for this one, I'm going to go ahead and draw a little bit more dimension to that letter. Same here. And don't worry about if the lines cross over. That's what the eraser's for. So, we've got a little bit more of a solid Y. And here you may have to change it up because as it twirls around, it may have to get a little bit smaller or more narrow. And it's okay if it's messy because this is not going to be your final artwork. And the cool thing is that, yeah, we are using light pencil, but after you're done coloring, you can go in and erase your pencil without affecting the marker. That's the cool thing about Sharpies is that they're permanent. It's also, something that can not be so cool if you draw on furniture or something like that, but it works really well in this case. All right, so I'm just going to repeat what I'm doing, and I've got my word U. So now I'm going to go ahead in the same order that I did for the small sketch and put in my A down below. And, you know, we're going a little fast for the video. This will be available later, and you can always pause and slow it down and take your time with it afterward. But you know, depending on your experience level, you might want to spend more time. You might want to just go quickly, but you don't have to necessarily. All right. So there's my L. I'm going to go ahead and put in my O. And if you notice, I'm skipping right ahead to doing the more solid lettering. And that's just for time. I would say if you're not that comfortable doing it, do like we did with the word you, just writing it in there, and then do this after the fact. The other thing too is, you know, it's up to you how much like your actual sketch you want to go. You can get really, you know, lax and just change it if you want to. I'm actually going to make this a little bit more curvy at the bottom than my original sketch. So I've got my E. There we go. All right. So now that I've got those letters in, I'm going to start with the other words. I am going to do these in the same way that I did the first by just drawing the words in. But even before that, I'm going to go ahead and put that line in. I would suggest that if you're not used to drawing on slants, you know, just to give yourself a baseline to work with. And again, you can just erase that. So I've got my A, my R, and my E. And then I've got my N, O, and T. All right. And then I'm just going to go ahead and create the block version of those. And you might be comfortable enough where you don't even have to do this part with pencil. You can go right into marker and do that. That is up to you. I'm going to get rid of this baseline. I don't need it. The eraser. And there we go. And then now I'm going to move on to N, O, and T, and just do the same thing. And, you know, when you get to doing your own kind of lettering, if you're doing it now or you do it later, your own design, it's really important to think about the spacing. You know, I personally like the look when things are sort of locked in. You know, I've got a little space here for one of my hearts, which is cool. But I'm trying to pull all these things together, and that's one of the purposes of creating it like this, is because you can get a sense of, you know, I want everything to work together in some way or another. Some of the curves follow each other, and all that. All right. So now I'm going to go ahead and put my top vine in. This one, I don't need to add a solid line necessarily, just for the vine itself. But I'm going to go ahead and put in my leaves. Just like that. And we're just following around, not trying to be perfect, you know, especially because it's a sketch, and when you get to doing your actual marker, you can more fine tune and finesse all this stuff. All right. And then I've got my bottom vine, so kind of following around the letters here and putting in my leaves. And I think this style is somewhere between, you know, cartoony and decorative. It's not completely one or the other. And the reason for that is just because we want it to be fun. All right. And if you notice, I'm getting smaller with my leaves just because it's getting closer to the letter. And that way we just have a nice design that goes all the way around. All right, so now that I've got that, I got my heart here. I'm gonna put my other little heart right there, and then one up here. All right, so I'm gonna pull this a little closer in case you guys can't see all of the detail. And you can see it's super sketchy. So that's kind of the point. Now I'm gonna get into the coloring. So because these are permanent markers, they don't blend like a regular marker might. You know, there are blendable markers with blenders that help, you know, get more gradients and things like that. But these are very permanent. It's almost like drawing with a black marker. So what we're gonna do is sort of like a fake blend. The first thing I'm gonna do is grab one of these light greens from the pack. And this is gonna be for our plants around the edges. So you go ahead and fine tune and draw one of your leaves here, work on the next one, and continue that around. Don't worry about filling it in just yet. This helps build our shape. And if you notice, I'm not making one continuous line. I could, but I think you have a lot more control with this sort of like sketchy line. And I've got my little drawing as a foundation underneath. So I'm just going to continue that around. Follow it around. Some of these, as they get smaller, I'm not necessarily doing the sketchy style, but at least you get the idea. And if you notice, I'm not actually following the sketch completely. So it's up to you. You can stick with it completely. You can venture out if you want to. That is your call. All right, so now that I've got that, I'm just gonna fill it in. This is a nice light green that we can use as a base. I would suggest if you're working with any kind of, you know, markers, colored pencils, that you go from light to dark. That way you can build up layers of color and create shading and depth and that sort of thing. If you go in with a dark color right away, it's very hard to fix that. So I would say start with a light color. If you want to make your vines purple, maybe start with a pink or a light purple or a light blue, that sort of thing. So then you can add a little bit more shadow afterward. And it really, you know, it doesn't matter what way you color this in. I'm just using little circles because it does a good job of getting a pretty solid fill. And what's interesting about these is, you know, obviously, as you know, there are different kinds, many of you know, there's different kinds of lettering. There's calligraphy lettering. And that's something you can't really do as well with Sharpies just because of the nature of the tips. You can get, you know, brush markers and that sort of thing and have a little bit more flexibility there. But that's one of the reasons I chose this style as opposed to a calligraphy sort of style. All right, so the nice thing is in this pack, there are many different greens to choose from. There's even a paler green than the one that I chose. So what I would suggest is if you haven't used these before and you want to see how this works, make a little swatch somewhere on the side. Doing this with that light green I just colored with. And I'm gonna test these out. So I'm gonna go with the lightest one, this one, and see if I like it. It's pretty dark. I've got another one here. It's almost like a sage color. That's pretty nice. This one is more of a blue-green. It's a lot like the first one. And then there's another one that's similar in tone, but it's not as bright. So that actually adds a little bit of depth. And if you guys, sorry about that. This was
I was just gonna say, can you hold it up a little
yes.
quick?
So, yeah, you're like, what are you drawing? Yeah, this is what it looks like. So this one, the one that I just used, gives you a little bit of depth, you know, without being too crazy. So depending on how soft you want your leaves to be, you might want to use that. I'm going to go with the one next to it, um, just because it's somewhere in between, and I think it'll look really good on camera. So with that, I'm going to create a little bit of depth, just imaginary, right? I mean, these aren't real leaves. They're very cartoony. But what I'm doing is I'm shading around the curvature of the leaf in lines. The reason is because the lines give me more flexibility for shading with permanent markers. If I were to just go in with a solid shading, it wouldn't have as soft of a gradient, and it'll make more sense here. So if I go in with lines that are further apart, right? I just shaded, but I didn't shade like crazy. Now, if I make them closer together as I go further out, it looks like it goes from light to dark, and then I can actually fill in at the very edge. So there's a little bit more of a gradient there. So that's kind of why I'm using these lines, is because it gives me a little bit more flexibility with permanent markers. So I'm giving a little bit of shadow to this. I'm also adding the shadow to the vine itself. All right, same thing here. Now, what's cool is if you wanted to, you could go in with some acrylic paint and even like dab little white highlights on here, do some sort of mixed media. It's totally up to you, you know, or gouache or something else that's more opaque. All right. So now the direction of my shadow is going to change a little bit because I want to get the underside darker. So I'm going to move to that part like that. And there are different ways to hold your marker too to get detail. So if you hold it straight up and down, you're going to get a finer tip than if you were to hold it on an angle. So if you want to get some fine lines and some fine shading, I would say try to hold it upright. But if you're doing fills, definitely go on an angle or even like sideways. All right, so that's just one of our little vines. We got that um, good to go. And then now I'm going to move on to the lettering. I've got a little line here in between that I want to get rid of, at least before I start. You might want to erase like inside your letters, because that's where we're going to color. And if we're going light, that pencil may show through, depending on how light of a pencil you used. I used kind of a darker one than usual for the video, but so I'm going to erase it. All right. So now that I've got that, I want to make this lettering orange. So obviously, orange is made up of basically two colors, yellow and red. So I'm going to start with the lightest of those, which is yellow. We've got a few yellows in here, but the lightest one is this one. And I'm going to use that and basically do the same thing I did with the vine and just color this in. You know, if you want, you can draw the outline, but with yellow, it's a little easier. I don't feel like you have to as much, just because it's a little bit more forgiving because it's light. All right, I'm just following that around. Like that. Same thing with my O. And then my U.
No questions, John. You must be explaining things perfectly.
Oh, good. Yeah, please, you guys, if you have any questions, feel free to shout out. For this one, I'm going to use 3 colors instead of 2 because I want to have a little bit more depth to it. I want the lettering to pop more than the vines. So I'm going to do orange, but again, I'm going to test it out over on the side. So I'll make a yellow block. And if you have bigger paper, you might want to do this over on the margins where this isn't showing. And that way you can sort of, frame this later if you want to. But I've got a couple of different options here, which are cool. So there are different things that you can use to make orange with yellow when it comes to Sharpies. There, you can actually use pink, which is kind of fun. So this pink, if I go and just color a little, it gives me a nice bright orange. It doesn't show up on screen as well, but in real life, it's like a neon orange. So that's the pink one. And then here's another one that's more like a melon color, which is a little bit darker. And then I've actually got another yellow, and I just kind of want to see what that's going to look like. And it's, it's like a deep rusty yellow. And then there is this one, which is almost like a deep salmon, which is going to be probably the darkest of those before getting to red. So I think for all intents and purposes, I'm going to go with the pink for now to get the next tone here for my orange. So I want to make it look as if the text is lit up from the top, just like the vines. So I'm going to leave the top fairly yellow and do the same technique that I did earlier with the greenery by using lines to shade. Think of it in terms of like if you were shading with a pencil, right? But really that space between your lines is going to help you keep those areas lighter. And as you get your lines closer together, it'll get darker. So with that, let me just do the same thing here. And as I get down to the bottom, I'm actually going to go ahead and fill it in. Because what I'm going to do is actually shade the bottom with a deeper redder color. All right, just follow that around. You can be as precise or as messy as you want to be. All right, so I've sort of finished that one. I'm gonna add a little bit more here. Orange, and
Can you
then
show a close-up of that one again?
for sure. So if you see, I've just done some shading by doing marks here, as opposed to trying to blend it, just because permanent markers don't really let you do that. And I've done some Sharpie pack illustrations this way, using different colors to create a sort of realism, and it seems to be the best way to do that. I think if Sharpie were to ever come out with a blender, that would be a true game changer. All right. Hint, hint, Sharpie. All right, there we go. I've got my bottom of my U. All right, so now I'm gonna go in with my darkest part of the orange, which I think I'm gonna use a red. So I wanna test it out first. I'm gonna test it out over here, see how it looks. I like it. And I'm gonna use this actually to create the outline around the lettering as well. So if I go lightly, make sure I focus on the tip of the marker, keep it upright to an extent. That'll help me with that. And it's nice because it just gives you, it makes the letters pop a little bit more when you give them an outline like this. And you can be as precise as you like with that. following this around.
And John, we did get a couple questions from the group. I figured I could read off and just kind of answer them live. One is, what makes the Mystic Gems markers different from other Sharpie markers?
Well, they are lighter, and they're pretty. I don't know when they came out, but they've only been around for a short amount of time, and they give you a lot more flexibility when you're trying to create the illusion of depth, and you know, you want colors outside the usual spectrum. They're really nice.
So functionality wise, they're the same as a Sharpie fine marker.
Yes.
In any other, you know, it's just a specialty color pack.
Exactly. Yeah.
John's point.
All right.
The other question, could answer in the chat, but can you buy individual Sharpie pens, markers, thinking reds and greens? And the answer to that is yes. Your local Michael's store would have individual colors. So instead of getting the full pack, you can get the individual colors.
Yeah, because I think this Mystic Gems pack has other colors in it as well. It's not just Mystic Gems, which is nice because you can round it out that way. Yep. Was there another question?
Nope, we answered both of them.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
All right, so I'm going to move on to now shading this letter a little bit. So in the same way I did before, I'm going to use some lines that are further apart. Just knocking Sharpies on the floor. And as I get toward the bottom for my darker part, I'm going to get a little closer together. So I'll hold this up so you guys can see that technique. Same thing down here. It's giving a little bit of shadow right there. And this is just a fun technique that I use, you know, that creates a little bit of depth and detail. So that's it, nothing crazy. I'm gonna go ahead here with the O, same thing. So I'm a big fan of early cartoonists like Winsor McCay, my hero, and I always thought I've always thought it has to do with the printing process. He did similar kind of coloring, just using marks like this, and I think it was because of the limitations on the ink in the newspaper. But I just think it's a really nice way to give some shading to something. By using more, you know, solid colors. All right, so there's my word "you," and essentially I'm just going to follow suit with the rest of it in this way. So, and because it makes sense, I'm just going to move from the top to the bottom. I'm going to do the heart next. So the heart is fairly simple. Using that same pink that I used earlier, I'm going to mostly fill it in, but I'm going to give it a little bit of a highlight. Like I was saying earlier, you could do mixed media and come back with a white highlight of acrylic paint or gouache or something like that to something, or you can just leave it white. So what I'm going to do is create my highlight first, like that. I'm going to create another one, and I'll pull this up close so you can see, and you might be like, what is that? But when I fill this in, that will be my little highlights on the heart. So I'm going to draw the rest of the heart around the edges, and then fill in everything except those shapes that I just made. So you can see I've got two little highlights at the top of the heart. I'm going to figure out what I want to use now for the rest of the heart. Instead of red, I think I'm going to use a purple, just so it doesn't look exactly like the rest of the lettering. So I've got that. I'm going to test it out on the side. Looks good. Go ahead, draw my outline. Like so. And that's it. And then if I want to, I can add a little bit of shading like I did with the other stuff, just like that. All right. So now moving on to the rest of the lettering. Um, Same thing with the yellow. I'm just going to fill in my A. Now I think we sent out, did we send out an example of this finished, I believe, for the class?
We did. Yeah,
Okay.
it should have come with the email.
So I may venture outside that a little bit. Initially, I had all this lettering exactly the same treatment, but I think I might give these a little bit of shadow just for fun. So, all right. Now that I've got those words filled in, I'm going to use my eraser and kind of get rid of the extra pencil. So as you see, because it's permanent marker, you don't have to worry about it being erased. All right. So moving on, I'm going to go ahead with my pink and do the same thing I did with the other lettering and just shade this in a little bit. You know, depending on how small your letters are, you might not have much flexibility with the shading, but that's okay. That's okay. Same deal down here. All right. And then here as well. Okay, so now I'm going to move on to the red, just like with the word you. Give it an outline. This will really make it pop. Like that. I'm not really going to give it that third level of shading because the letters are pretty small. And I think if I go in with, you know, too much red, not only will it make it look exactly like this, it's kind of nice to have something a little bit different. It might kind of ruin the form a little. But what I am going to do is give this a little bit of dimension by, I'll do two things. One of these I'm going to add a shadow to, and the other one I'm going to give a little bit of dimension to. So just so we can kind of go through the exercise. All right. So if you want to give something, lettering a very simple shadow, it's pretty easy. I'm going to use this darkest color and follow, think about light coming from one direction and put your shadow on the other side. So at this point, I'm thinking of the light coming from the top and to the right. So it's going to leave a shadow on the left and bottom. Bottom of this part, I'm going to leave a shadow, left, bottom, left. There really is no bottom under the top of the A. Left, bottom. So it can really make your lettering pop nicely. And it's fairly easy to do. With this one, I'm going to give it a little bit more like dimension, like I was saying. So with that, instead of making shadows, I'm going to draw a line down that basically goes in the same direction as the shadows and create a block to the left and then a block on the bottom. Same thing here. On the left, there really is no bottom there. But what you want to do is kind of have it angled downward like that. Just like that. And then same here, down on the left and bottom. Don't forget there's a little divot in here. I'm gonna hold it up so you guys can see it. And then you can put any color you want in there. I'm gonna go with pink just because I feel like it'll work with this design and it'll pop out pretty well. Just like that. All right, so now I'm gonna move on to my other hearts. They're pretty small, so I might not even give them any highlights, but you can, obviously, if you just, wield the tip of the marker carefully. But I'm just gonna make them filled. And then using my purple, go ahead and outline those and give them a little shadow. And what's nice about this is I would suggest trying to be consistent with whatever shape you're doing. So the hearts, I'm making them all the same. You can make them different colors if you want to, but it tends to be a lot easier to process a simpler design than it is something that's crazy and has all kinds of colors in it. But you guys do you, and that is totally your call. All right, so I'm gonna go back to my vine on the bottom using that light green and return to where I was in the beginning. Just first gonna make the vine line. Do that. And start to make my leaves.
And John, just while you're doing that, Raina and I added to the chat the JPEG scan of the original artwork too, just in case anybody wanted to download the original one. I know you some of the lettering and some of the shading a little bit, but again, that'll be a good reference for anybody after the class too.
Thank you. That's wonderful. All right, so I'm filling this in. And depending on where you live, if you live where it's summer is really starting to bloom, things are starting to bloom, it's getting warmer, you can just go outside and do this, even draw from life. This is an exaggeration, obviously, but you don't always have to draw things realistically. You can take your creative liberties with things. All right. Almost done filling this in. All right, so that's filled in. And then I'm gonna go in with, make sure I have the right color here. Let's see, what was it? Sometimes it's hard to tell because the markers can dry a little darker than when you first put them down. So I think this may have been the one. There we go. All right. This one I'm gonna outline just for fun. Just to mix it up and so you guys aren't watching me do the same thing over and over again. But you can do it however you like. And if you notice, I'm not completely filling in or following the lines per se. I like to color outside the lines a little bit, just because I like that look. All right, so now that I've got that, I'm gonna give my leaves a little bit of shading, just like the one up above. So going underneath. I think it's, with this one, because I've given it an outline, I'm not going right up to the edge. That's another thing you can do to sort of create depth, is if you want to give something an outline and then the shading that you do doesn't necessarily go right up to it, it kind of gives you almost like a glow from underneath in a way. So I know I'm going over a few different kinds of techniques here, but hopefully you'll find one you like. And even with more experimentation, you'll find things that you like that I didn't even do here. All right, finish this up. And I'm just kind of going in with little dots, basically, at this point, because I have that outline. All right, so I've got that vine finished. Now I'm going to move on to the final word. And using that bright yellow that I had before, just fill this in. And you can find so many different styles of hand lettering online as examples for free. If you want to just Google, you know, hand lettering, cartoon lettering, um, uh, graffiti lettering, or anything, Pinterest is loaded with this kind of stuff. So if you want to get inspired, you want to copy, really, if you want to learn how to draw in general, go ahead and copy. That's what my teacher taught me when I went to art school. So, and that's how I learned, just by copying. I'm also a painter, so I copied a lot of painters to kind of get started. And it was a really good way to learn their technique. Some people thought like, oh, don't copy anybody because that's not really art. But if you want to learn technique, copy, 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 copy. And then you'll eventually find your own. All right. All right, so I've got that filled in with yellow. I'm gonna go in with pink and do the same as I did with the lettering up above. So just giving it some light shading here and then getting darker as I go down to the bottom. Just like that. Now, the one thing I didn't do anything with is cursive. So, you know, that's a little bit more advanced, but just as a heads up, it's good to plan that stuff out. So let's say this was like, I don't know, we wanted to have some letters kind of weave into each other. You can draw so that it wraps around another part of your letter, but you know your shading would follow that, so you wouldn't just draw on top of it. It's hard to explain without a visual, but it's a whole different animal when working in that way, but it's really fun. Okay, we got our shading here. Just like that. Maybe I'll put a little bit more orange up top there on the E. Okay, and then going back to red for my outline and my shadows. So just faintly draw the shadow there, or the outline there rather. Just like that. And you know, I'm doing this sort of like sketchy, right? And that is great. But if you really want to get super good at working with Sharpies and markers in general, I would suggest just, you know, get a piece of paper and draw like nuts, loosely, you know, until you feel really confident about your line. Because there are people that can sit here and just go like that and it's perfect. And I'm not one of those people. I tend to work in smaller bits. It's just what I'm comfortable with. But, you know, I think if you wanted to, that's what I would recommend, is just really playing around with these until you get super confident. Yeah. Then we've got our E. All right. So, and then finally, we're just going to add a little bit of shading to these letters too. So similar to what we did up here, just go very lightly like that. And then as we get further closer to the bottom, you can do some more. Same here. Same there. And then here too. All right, so now that this is pretty much done, I can just kind of go over some other things that we can play around with too. So you can go ahead and fill this background. If you don't like it white, you can go ahead and make it another color. What might be really cool is to go with a darker color since we've done this so lightly. So I'm gonna take this blue, it's like the darkest blue we got, and just fill in around my background. Trying to be careful not to overstep too much of what I've already drawn. But when you get to the white area, you can kind of go nuts. You don't have to worry about that so much. And, you know, if you're working in light colors and you go with a darker color behind it, it's really going to make it jump off your page. And you might even want to, if you're so inclined, mess around with this even more and do a gradient in the same way as we're doing, I did these letters. So if you went with like sort of a medium tone color for about half of this, and then did some shading in between as it gets darker toward the bottom, you can do that too.
Lots of compliments from the chat on the class.
Oh, awesome.
Always so thorough as always. One question that did come up too is can you combine the work that you're doing with the Sharpie permanent markers and then colored pencils as well?
Absolutely, yeah. It's interesting. You can draw with Sharpies over colored pencils or draw with colored pencils over Sharpies. You know, they do different things in either way. So I would say just experiment with it and see what you can come up with. I think if you go over, you know, these bright colored Sharpies with like a white colored pencil or something like that, it may take away the richness of it a little bit. So that's the one watch out I would say is, you know, if you're going over with a lighter color, it's not going to have the same vivid quality as the ink will. Colored pencils, especially like, you know, Prismacolor color pencils, are super vibrant on their own, but they're a different kind of vibrant. You know, so if you were to put these next to each other, they wouldn't have the same kind of look and feel, obviously, because they have a different base behind them. So I think with color pencils, it's a wax, where with this, obviously, it's usually alcohol or water for the ink, and I think these are alcohol.
Thank you for that. And then probably one last question too is, do you have to do that to the background? I'm assuming somebody loves it the way that it is.
Oh, no, not at all. I'm just doing this because we have a little extra time. And I wanted to show how that can look if you wanted to just change it up. But no, not at all. You can definitely leave things as the way they are. A lighter background is fine. You know, this is just an option because you might think, oh, okay, well, it looks good, but maybe I want to mix it up. Maybe I want to do something a little different. And, you know, you could even bring in a darker green so it offsets the vines a little bit. But I mean, leaving it just white has a very spring-like feel, which is cool. And it really, you know, you can make the little shapes pop a little bit more like that. Just pop off the page. So What you might want to do too is, before you even get started, just mess around on the side like this with a separate piece of paper. See how these all react with each other. It's going to give you a lot more control over what you're doing. And, or you can just do it as you do it. But yeah, I think before sitting down to do something, finite or as fine as this, definitely go nuts first if you haven't. And kind of see how far they'll go. So what I was saying earlier too is, like about a grade in the background, I can take black, and if I were to do like the bottom part of this a little bit darker, I can do shading that way. So you see it makes that blue a little bit darker. You could add shadows to your letters that way. There's so many possibilities, and that's what's really fun about these. So, and you don't have to use the same method that I'm using for shading. You can try dots. So if any of you have ever done stippling, that's another way you can shade. I'm basically trying to cram 5 lessons in here, guys. But like if I were to take a lighter color like that, my lighter blue, and I said you can do your lines like, and as you get further apart, they'll get light, the gradation will get lighter, but you can also use dots. So the further apart the dots are, the lighter gradient you'll get, and as you get them closer together, you can get a darker tone, and maybe even eventually, it's just a solid fill. If that makes sense. There's so many ways to shade. Those are just some of them. You can do cross hatching, which is really cool as well. And it's all about really, the space between those lines. As they get closer together, your shading is going to get darker and darker and darker. And the further apart, the lighter it's going to get. So I'd love to see if any of you have anything and you want to share. I'd love to see on screen what's going on. Very nice. Wow, that's beautiful. So, oh, wait, they changed. Avani, very nice. Maha, beautiful. Wow. It's cool to see how many different ways this got interpreted. Super exciting. Love it. Thanks for sharing, everybody. It was really fun. Definitely reach out on the social media and share this with Michael, or share this with Michaels and Sharpie as well. Thanks so much. Take care.